Imagine this. You're asleep in your own home, your family tucked in safely, when suddenly your front door is smashed open in the middle of the night. Flashbang grenades explode inside, armed FBI agents storm in, and before you even realize what's happening, you're dragged outside in handcuffs and held at gunpoint. And here's the shocking part. They had the wrong house. That nightmare became reality for a Georgia family. And their fight for justice has now made its way all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In a landmark ruling, the court issued a 9-0 unanimous decision against the FBI, siding fully with the family. This ruling doesn't just matter for them. It has sweeping implications for government accountability, wrongful raids, and the rights of ordinary citizens when federal agencies make reckless mistakes. This case is known as Martin v. United States. It began back in 2017, just outside Atlanta, when FBI agents carried out a pre-dawn raid. Their mission was to capture suspected gang members. But instead of arriving at the correct location, the lead FBI agent relied on his personal GPS device, which routed them to the wrong address, the home of Katrina Martin, her partner, and her 7-year-old child. Without warning, the agents smashed in the Martins' door, threw flashbang grenades, and stormed the house. Katrina's partner, startled and terrified, hid in a closet, but agents dragged him out, handcuffed him, and held him at gunpoint. Katrina herself was pulled outside half-dressed, arrested, and also held at gunpoint. Even their young child was taken during the raid. It wasn't until the agents were already inside, searching the home, that one noticed mail on a table with a different address. The realization hit them. They had raided the wrong house. The Martins filed a lawsuit under the Federal Tort Claims Act, FTCA, a law that allows ordinary citizens to sue the federal government when federal employees commit wrongful acts while carrying out their official duties. Normally, the government shields itself and its agents from lawsuits with doctrines like qualified immunity, but the FTCA is one of the few avenues available for holding federal agencies accountable. The government, however, fought back. They argued that the case fell under the FTCA's exceptions, specifically the discretionary function exception, claiming that the FBI agent's use of his GPS and the way he prepared for the raid were discretionary decisions, and therefore the family had no right to sue. The district court in Georgia agreed with the government and dismissed the case. The family appealed to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, but the appellate court also sided with the FBI, ruling that because the agent had discretion in how he carried out the operation, the mistake, no matter how severe, was protected. Finally, the Martins petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court, and the justices agreed to take up the case. At the end of their most recent term, the court issued a unanimous 9-0 ruling in favor of the Martins, rejecting the FBI's claims. This was a rare moment where all 9 justices stood together and said, the federal government can in fact be held accountable when it makes these kinds of egregious mistakes. The Supreme Court, in a unanimous opinion written by Justice Neil Gorsuch, overturned the ruling made by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals and sent the case back down for a new decision. Here's what happened. The Supreme Court clarified that the law enforcement proviso only applies to the intentional tort exception under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA. It does not extend to override all the other exceptions in the law. This may sound technical, but it's an important legal distinction. More importantly, the court rejected the 11th Circuit's broad claim of immunity. The justices made it clear that the federal government is not automatically immune from lawsuits just because an officer's actions are connected to federal policy, or because they can be loosely characterized as being consistent with federal law. That interpretation, according to the court, is not how the FTCA was designed to work. Instead, the court emphasized that liability under the FTCA must be judged by state law. The statute specifically says the federal government can be held liable in the same way a private individual would be under similar circumstances, following the laws of that state. What this means is that courts cannot create blanket immunity for the government, like the 11th Circuit tried to do. They have to look at the actual state law and ask the question, if a private person had acted the same way in this situation, could they be held liable? With that reasoning, the Supreme Court vacated the 11th Circuit's decision and sent the case back for reconsideration based on this ruling. Now, it's important to note that the Supreme Court did not decide whether the discretionary function exception actually blocks this lawsuit. That decision is left to the 11th Circuit on remand. The appeals court will now have to determine whether the family's claims are barred by that exception. So the question becomes, was it simply a discretionary action for that FBI agent to use his personal GPS, get the address wrong, and make the mistake that led to this case? If it was considered discretionary, then he might still be shielded under the law. But if not, liability could attach. That's where the case now stands. The Supreme Court has set the rules, and the 11th Circuit will have to apply them in reviewing this case once again. Now you might be wondering, what does any of this mean for gun owners? And why should we care? Here's the reason this case is so important. When government agencies carry out wrong house raids, mistaken identity arrests, or use excessive force, it's often law-abiding gun owners who feel the impact the most. We've seen multiple high-profile cases where the ATF, the FBI, or even state agencies like California's DOJ have raided the wrong person or made serious errors. These mistakes can lead to innocent people being harmed, families traumatized, and property destroyed. If the government were able to simply claim discretion every time it made one of these mistakes, there would be no real accountability. But with this Supreme Court ruling in the Martin case, the government's ability to hide behind broad immunity has been narrowed. This decision makes it clear that federal agents can and should be held accountable when they recklessly invade someone's home or abuse their power. This was a unanimous 9-0 decision, which makes it even more significant. It sends a strong message that the courts cannot invent blanket protections for federal officers when state law would hold a private citizen accountable for the same actions. Now the case goes back to the 11th Circuit. They'll need to take another look at it in light of the Supreme Court's ruling. They might decide to handle the review themselves, or they could send it down to the district court for a completely fresh review. Either way, it will be very interesting to see how this unfolds and what it means for future cases. As soon as there are new developments, I'll make sure to update you. If you found this video helpful and want to support the channel, the best way is to subscribe so you don't miss future updates. Thank you all for your continued support. I truly appreciate it.